Today, we're going to be talking about if you're training often enough to maximize your strength gains. Training frequency is one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make when trying to get strong, because ultimately, a lot of us started in bodybuilding principles, and these principles just don't apply when it comes to strength. First of all, training frequency is important when we go to build strength because we're not training our muscles, we're training our nervous system. Our brain connects to our body through nerve conduction. We send a message down, it then communicates to the muscle to contract, and that muscle either fully contracts or does not contract. So right now, sitting here, if you contract your quad about half as hard as you can, this is not your entire quad contracting 50%. This is 50% of your quad contracting 100%. Our muscles can either be entirely on or entirely off. Now, navigating this when we go to complex movements like deadlifts, squats, and overhead presses can pose a serious challenge. And ultimately, building strength is having our brain connect to the right parts of our muscles to perform the right parts of the movement at the right time. This coordination ultimately leads to extremely powerful lifts. The problem, though, is that often people will train once or twice a week per movement. If you train once or twice a week per movement, you're not going to maximize the amount of time and exposure that your nervous system is going to get to these loads. It is a bit of a catch-22, and this is the difficult part, because if you train very often and very heavy, well, you're not really going to do much but burn yourself out. If you train very heavy and not very often, well, you're not going to get the results from a nervous standpoint that you want. And if you train very often and very light, well, you're just going to be wasting your time. So what exactly do we do? I've told you about why training frequency is important, but there's much more to unpack here. Ultimately, I need you to think about training for strength as skill development, not necessarily as muscular progression. There are some carryovers, there are some crossovers, but it is not the same thing in and of itself. The next part to consider is that it is paramount when you're trying to get strong that your tendons and ligaments need to keep up to your muscles. They do not recover near at the same rate as your active tissue or your muscle because they don't have their own blood supply. Well, how do they recover then? Well, they recover through contractions and relaxation. The contraction squeezes fluid out of the tissue, just like a sponge. And when you relax, just like if a sponge was dropped in water and it was dry, it will soak the fluid back up. That movement of fluid is what's going to be most effective for recovering your soft tissues. Of course, if you're not moving, you're not going to be able to recover your soft tissues. So let's get to the meat of the conversation. How often should you be training? The answer might not be as concrete as you want, but we are going to get there. Bear with me. Ultimately, you should be training as frequently as you can recover from. How do you know if you're recovering? Well, are your lifts progressing? Do you have the 3 signs of sympathetic fatigue? Are you irritable? Are you having difficulty sleeping? And has your appetite changed? If all 3 of those are no, you're probably on a good course. Now, you're only going to be on a good course for a handful of weeks, after which time you're going to have to deload. You're going to have to cut your sets in half and cut the loads down by about 30%. After that week, you should be good, fresh, and ready to start again. The idea of this style of periodization is you're going to increase your strength, you're going to deload, and you're going to drop down your loads a little bit, and you're going to start the next block slightly higher than you began the last block, but lower than the peak of your first block. And the peak of your second block will be higher than the peak of your first block. The trough of your third block or the beginning of your third block is going to be higher than the beginning of your second block, so on and so forth. Ultimately, this is going to lead to an undulation reaching some sort of peak. This peak will be your maximum strength capacity for that period of time. Now, after that, you're going to have to change stimulus, go to some hypertrophy, go to some muscular endurance, something to freshen up your system before you go into your next strength block where you build a better base and start from a stronger point than you did before. Ultimately, that sums up how to get strong and how often to train how to get strong, but it leaves more questions than answers. I'm going to give you a guideline now on how frequently you can train. The answer might surprise you. If you are a novice lifter, per movement, you're going to be able to train anywhere from 4 to 7 days per week. Why is this the case? And this is training with intent. This is the case because you're so far away from your genetic potential, you don't really know how to do the movements. Your body does not know how to do them efficiently. And so your best course of action is going to be to do these extremely high frequency at a moderate level of intensity. That way, you're going to learn the movements as quickly as possible. As we move to more of an intermediate lifter, let's say you have worked in your strength training diligently for 6 months plus. Now we're at the stage where you can't be doing something every day and expect any sort of results because you are now going to have your brain communicating relatively effectively to your body, and now your muscles are going to be closer to their capacity, and we don't need to start blowing ourselves out. At this stage, you can train each movement 3 to 5 times a week. There are many systems from Eastern Europe that have people training up to 10 times per week per movement, and they showed some really good results. Now, they also showed some catastrophic injuries, but nonetheless, it is a way to progress. So if you're an intermediate, anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week, I find appropriate. Now, once we get into these ranges and we get into intermediate training, you can't behave like a novice where you're going to train hard every single session. We now have to consider, how are those sessions going to slightly differ from each other? Well, let's say session number 1 is a traditional powerlifting session where you're doing anywhere from 1 to 5 reps at an intensity of anywhere from 6 to 9 out of 10. After that, you're going to move to some accessory work that could be heavy accessory work, no problem. In your next session, you're going to want to try to expose some sort of weakness from that first session. If you're squatting and you tend to shift towards your left leg, well, that second session could be dedicated towards using unilateral work to build any sort of neural differences. And again, we're talking nerves. We're not talking muscles. And this is where we divert from the bodybuilding dogma. You can squat on Monday and you can split squat on Tuesday. The example I always give is every time you stand out of a chair, you're squatting. So everyone here and everyone listening to this video has squatted every day of their life for however many years you've been alive. You don't take a rest day from squatting. We just have to consider how intense and what sort of volumes are we doing, and is that something that we need substantial time to recover from? So the answer to increasing frequency is going to be decreasing the intensity, but even more so, decreasing the total volume, where you can do one set of one squat at 7 out of 10 RP and come back the next day or 2 days later and do a split squat at a 7 out of 10 RP and do a 3 sets of 5. You might have some glute pain the first couple of sessions, the first couple of weeks, but you're quickly going to be able to adapt to this where you don't have a muscular stimulus. You strictly have a stimulus and an adaptation from the nervous system to be able to progress. So we've covered session number 1, powerlifting style, session number 2, addressing weaknesses, session number 3. Now we could go back to a strength style. We could go to a power type style of training, something that is moderate intensity and low volume. Those 3 sessions, for most people in the intermediate range, are going to be recoverable. Now, I said intermediate is from 6 months onward. Of course, we're going to get to the advanced stage at some points. And the advanced stage is going to be from anywhere from 2 years of regular training and onwards. Now, I say regular training. We are committed to making progress with your strength. At this stage, the frequency has to drop down again. We're going to say anywhere from 1 to 3 times maximum per week. Now, there aren't even many advanced lifters who could train 3 times per week. Let me explain why. As you get stronger and stronger and you reach your genetic potential, you need a certain level of stimulus in order to continue refining and adapting the neural connections that you've built as an intermediate and as a novice. If we are working on those connections at a reasonable intensity and our squat absolute load is 600 or 700 pounds, regardless of how easy that moves, it is still 600 or 700 pounds. We do have adaptations to our nervous system, but ultimately you are still a human being. We all still have our limitations. Even myself, even the other World's Strongest Man winners have places that we cannot go or else we'll get injured and we start to burn out. Now I say 1 to 3 times per week. 3 times per week, it depends on the movement. I could overhead press 3 times a week and be totally okay. I could not deadlift or squat 3 times a week and be okay. In fact, I can only deadlift once and squat once per week before I start to feel some sort of back pain. This is not a nervous problem. This is not a systemic sympathetic issue. This is that you are so close to your genetic potential and the tissue capacity of all of your soft tissues, which have a diminishing return to how strong that they can get, that something has to give at some stage, and you have to give respect to something having to give. So advanced lifters, unfortunately, we're stuck 1 to 3 times per week. The ultimate superpower would be maximizing the recovery to be able to train 3 to 5 times per week like a novice, refine, ingrain, and improve these motor patterns like you are a novice. That would be what takes all of the records up 10% or 20%. And one day it's totally possible that we get there. But for now, here are the 3 recovery principles that you should use to maximize your training frequency that you can recover from. Number 1 is your nutrition. Your macronutrients are one thing, but your micronutrients are what helps your macronutrients digest, absorb, and be utilized by your body. I have a free guide to nutrition down in the link in the description and in the pinned comment that you should pick up for more information on that. Number 2 is improving your sleep quality. Again, I have a free PDF down in the link in the description and in the pinned comment with a free recovery test that includes all of the parameters that you should use to improve your sleep as much as possible. And number 3, you should manage your life stress. This isn't saying you should live a non-stressful life, but you should be aware that your sympathetic reactions to stressful situations will be a substantial detractor from your progress in the gym. If you're the type of person to get extremely worked up, to get anxious, to get really upset, these are sympathetic stressors that are going to add to the sympathetic stress from your training, and you have to account for that when you think about your training frequency. Ultimately, the more you recover, the more you're able to train, the more frequently you're able to train, and the better athlete you're going to be. But the challenge is that if you overstretch this and you under-recover, you're going to end up injured, hurt, and behind where you started. Be smart about your training. If I can help you along the way, I would love to. With Moose Coaching, with our programs on sale, down the link in the description and in the pinned comment. Regardless, all of my free information that you get on YouTube. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and go ahead, pop a comment, whatever you'd like to say. If you have nothing to say, leave a moose dropping. As per always, lift heavy, be kind. Merch link is in the description, and I will catch you tomorrow.